So when Patty and I talked a little bit about the strategery as how we would approach this, we thought that probably the most appropriate thing would be to do the historical background, which I tried to touch upon at least some basic structure of the situation at the time of Joshua, but then get into a specific subject, and the one that is always the most natural is the subject of Jericho. For a number of reasons. One is the infamous nature of the account. The other is it sort of gives us a teaching tool for giving you some archaeology 101. It's pretty easy to walk through in that sense. It also gives us, it's an apologetic example of scholars who make claims about the Bible, who say that the archaeology says the Bible's wrong about X, Y, and Z. And then in time, when further work is done and the arguments are looked at more closely, we find that the arguments were poor, incomplete, we didn't have enough data. What we call arguments from silence often are the case. That's a fallacy, that's something to look for. No one has ever found an inscription in Egypt that refers to Moses, therefore Moses didn't exist. Now that's an argument from silence, right? What you want to deal with is the evidence that you do find. Now in archaeology, the evidence is highly incomplete. Think of it as a widget factory. You're pumping out 100 widgets a minute, and you're just pulling one out of the 100 out. Archaeology is kind of like that. Only a very small percentage of the ancient world has ever been excavated related to the Bible. And then those remains have to be processed, analyzed, and then published. And that number is even less. So what we have is actually a very small picture of what the potential in the world of archaeology is. So I'll give you an example. My first experience of digging at an archaeological site was at the city of Hatzor, which is mentioned in Joshua chapter 11. It's in northern Israel. It was a massive city in antiquity. In fact, in the Bible it says it was the head of all those kingdoms, and that's exactly what it was, the head of all those kingdoms. It's a gargantuan site. The excavator there estimates that it would take 600 years to excavate Hatzor, based on the size that it is. And so that gives you just an example. That's just one site. And there were many sites in Mesopotamia, especially ones mentioned in the Genesis 10 narrative, that were enormous. Nineveh, for example, and other cities. So the point I'm making here is simply, for you, as you're critically thinking about claims that come in your direction in the culture that we live in, your kids, your grandkids, people make truth claims. We want to test those truth claims, and one of them is saying, well, because we didn't find X, Y, or Z, therefore the Bible's not accurate, therefore the Bible was wrong. Another fallacy often is the case that people will argue something against the Bible that the Bible doesn't actually say. So an example of that would have to do with the conquest. People have this perception that Joshua's conquest of Canaan, he came in and they leveled and obliterated everything. That's actually not the case. Yes, the Israelites destroyed cities, Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. But in several places in the biblical text, it says they did not destroy the cities. In fact, it says, God says to Moses and the Israelites, you will live in cities you did not build, right? So that infers that they're going to live in Canaanite cities. And that's exactly what happens. They live in the infrastructure of the land that's left behind. So I'm using that as an example to you, simply to, we want to test everything, as Paul says, and hold on to the good. Testing truth claims takes a lot of work. And in the world we live in now, with social media and the internet, we have access to more misinformation than any people in the history of mankind. And that's a challenge for us. It's coming at us in such, I said fire hose before. I mean, we're talking about the Pacific Ocean of information that comes at us. So We have to be discerning as the church as to how much we can expose ourselves to. That's an individual decision we all have to make. But my encouragement along these lines is to love the Lord your God with all of your mind. Love him with all of your mind. Be a critical thinking believer and follower of Jesus. You don't put aside your intellect when you follow Christ. We follow him with all of who we are. Now I know you know that, but it's an encouragement to you. Along those lines, the archaeology, on the sort of more positive side, if you want to say, is remarkable in that what has been discovered correlates so well with the biblical account. You saw some of that with the Amarna letters, the historical background, and so on. So Jericho is a sort of parade example of that. And so it's my privilege to share with you some of the research that our ministry has done as it relates to the city of Jericho. Now, I have to give credit where credit's due. My colleague, Dr. Bryant Wood, who is an archaeologist, his PhD from the University of Toronto. This one would be fun for you. He did his dissertation on Canaanite pottery of the late Bronze Age. So that sounds like a real snoozer. And for most people would be, except in the case of, as it relates to the late Bronze Age, that's exactly the time that Joshua and the Israelites entered the land. So nothing like a strong evangelical Christian who knows his pottery from the late Bronze Age to refute arguments against the Bible. So what I'm sharing with you is not original to my work. It's what I've been able to assimilate from what Dr. Wood has taught me, and he deserves the credit for it. And as I mentioned in the previous segment, you can watch our interview with Dr. Wood on our show, Digging for Truth. And also an interview I do with my friend Joel Kramer, who does a nice job of giving the big picture, and that's what I'm going to try to do, to give you the big picture of the destruction of Jericho. So Jericho is famous, of course, because that's, where the walls came tumbling down, right? Joshua fought the Jericho. We learned that in Sunday school, although I didn't learn it in Sunday school because I didn't repent and believe in the Lord Jesus until I was 28. So rather later in life, but if I had gone to Sunday school, I certainly would have learned about the city of Jericho, right? And the walls come tumbling down. So let's talk about it. Here's one of 1,000 quotes you can find out there in the world of truth. It's sarcastic. Undoubtedly, the biblical story of the Battle of Jericho is legendary. This is based on the archaeology that's been done at Jericho. This is a conclusion drawn by many, many biblical scholars and archaeologists. So let me give you a little bit of context. Earlier, we talked about chronology, which is often boring to people, and another thing that's boring is geography, right? Now, see, in the old days, geography wasn't boring because it was a fun conversation between husband and wife. Will you please pull over and ask somebody at the gas station where you're going? Okay. Now we have, phones and stuff, so it's eliminated this contentious. It's one of the benefits of technology, right? We don't have that fight in the car anymore. It's over something else. You're driving too fast or whatever. But so here's some generic geography for you. Here we have, remember Dead Sea down at the bottom? That's the northern part of the Dead Sea. Turn left, and you're at Jerusalem, okay? If you go up to Shechem, up in the north, that's where we have the covenant renewal ceremony. In the book of Joshua, we have the establishment of the religious worship center at Shiloh, which is sort of halfway in between, maybe a little bit further north, right, where the tabernacle was, the stories of in 1 Samuel related to the tabernacle and so on. But you can see Jericho is near the Jordan River. It's in the Jordan Rift Valley. It is in the eastern part of the country. And after the death of Moses, the Israelites are going to cross over. There's a miracle that takes place, right? The Jordan River is stopped up, and they cross over into the land to attack the city of Jericho. Now, Jericho is the perfect entry point for the country from this side, and this is why the city was built there. It was also built there because there's a well there, and it's a well-defended site. So that was some of the reasons why people built cities and places in the ancient world was water, and defensibility often was the case. someplace that you could easily see enemies coming. Those were some of the criteria. And so in the ancient world, you see a city built, and then maybe it's destroyed or abandoned, and a couple centuries later, somebody builds on top of it. And somebody builds on top of it. Somebody builds on top of it. Because the location, right? And this is what we find at Jericho. The remains go back many centuries, long before the time of Joshua. So there's some general geography for you. Here's an aerial view of Jericho looking south. It looks like a mound of dirt. I mean, to the untrained eye, that's what it looks like. You can see it's scarred quite a bit, and that's from all the excavation that's taken place at Jericho. It's about 9.5 acres in size. All right? This is not the same Jericho, by the way, as the one is mentioned in the New Testament. There was a new city that was called Jericho that was built nearby. The story of Zacchaeus is related to that. Okay, so I'm going to share with you just a couple of key figures in the story of Jericho. One is this British archaeologist named John Garstang. Doesn't he look like an archaeologist? I mean, look at that garb, you know? I mean, we don't dress like that when we go out to the site, but I wish we did. But anyway, he dug in the 1930s, and we had the onset of the Second World War, and then his colleague, Kathleen Kenyon, excavated at Jericho in the 1950s. By the way, in case you're curious, down at the bottom of the screen, those are death masks from the Neolithic period. This is very early archaeological period. People would put these masks on people's faces like a plaster, you know, so they're death masks. They're kind of creepy, but this is from way before the time of Joshua. All right, so here's the bottom line of what the argument is as it relates to Jericho. I'm simplifying this greatly, but Kenyon, after her excavations, claimed that the city of city of Jericho was destroyed, and the walls fell down, and it was destroyed by fire. But it happened 150 years before the Bible says it happened. So the debate about Jericho has to do with the date of its destruction. It doesn't have to do with the debate about its location. Nobody disagrees about where Jericho was, which is not the case with Ai. If you watch our show on Ai, there was a debate about where the site of Ai was located, and our argument was that they identified the wrong site and they dug at it and they didn't find evidence consistent with the Bible, so they thought it was the wrong site, that they thought the Bible was wrong, and we came along and said, well, you dug at the wrong place. That's not the case with Jericho. It's a different situation. Everybody agrees that Jericho is Jericho. So the debate is about dating. So I'm going to tell you some about the dating issues. It has to do with pottery, but I don't want to get into the minutia too much. I want to keep you focused on the big picture. And I'll explain that as I go along, and especially in the summary at the end. Big picture. So now there's a couple problems with some of the conclusions that Kenyon made. One of the major problems with her work was that she didn't publish a lot of analysis of the pottery that she discovered at Jericho. And that's a problem because pottery is related, as I answered the gentleman's question earlier about dating, it's critical for establishing dates of occupation in sites. The kind of pottery that was used by the local population, did they import pottery, to what degree did they import it, those kind of questions. The Canaanites lived there, so what we find there is Canaanite pottery. And when you excavate a site, you must provide a very detailed, in-depth analysis of what it is you discover. And you make an argument for the time period it's from and what kind of pottery it is, and what is a cooking pot, or is it a storage jar, or whatever kind of object it is, or pottery it is that you find. And you document it, and then you put it out there, and then you let people debate with you, other experts in the field, about your analysis. That's what scholarship is, right? So one of the problems is when Dr. Wood looked at the work, she didn't publish really what he feels is enough analysis of the pottery. Now, what happened, both her and Kenyon found, and you can refer to this late Bronze I period, is in your handout from before, the chronology handout. This is about the time of the conquest and a little bit before that. So the pottery changes over time. Think of like if you went to your grandmother's house or your great-grandmother's house and you looked at her dishes, you just know that she's had them for 40, maybe 50 years, and you know that they're not contemporary, right? A plate is a plate, but its shape, thickness, color, design has changed over time, and you know from experience that there's been a change in the style. You know, oh, that looks like something from the 50s. You know, think of a 57 Chevy. You know, you watch people driving around Cuba, you go, these cars from the 50s, right? So it's the same kind of thing with pottery. It changes over time. There's things that last longer than other forms, right? Very similar. Cars, think of your grandma's house, that kind of thing. Gives you an idea about pottery. Very basic sketch. So both archaeologists found tons of stuff from the time of Joshua. Here's just some pictures of some pottery from that period. You have to take my word for it because I know you don't know anything about pottery. Dr. Wood has analyzed all of this pottery, and he's an expert on it. The drawings is what we do for all forms that are found that are significant at a site, and you can see the different, there's bowls, there's oil lamps, there's juglet down on the bottom right, number 14. You can see over on the left, you can see there's paint. You can see the rim down on the bottom right on the left side. You can see a rim, that's how we identify the pottery forms and so on. So the point I'm making is simply was an enormous amount of local pottery found at Jericho. It doesn't surprise us. Jericho was a very important city. The Canaanites lived there. The Bible says they lived there. They had their own pottery kiln, or they made pottery, or they brought it in from other towns. They had to live. They had to store their olive oil, their grain, their cooking pots. I mean, this is part of life. Think of your dishes. Think of your kitchen, how much you use your stuff over and over and over and over again, right? It's a regular part of your life. Pottery was the same way in the ancient world. So let's talk a little bit about, so we have the pottery situation. We feel that the analysis wasn't done very well. Dr. Wood has analyzed the pottery, and basically that's his area of expertise, and has concluded, look, the pottery is from the time of Joshua. So to say the city was destroyed 150 years earlier, the pottery forms don't fit the argument. That's fundamentally Dr. Wood's argument that he makes, okay? So again, that's a big picture kind of thing. You know, you have the Bible telling you the Canaanites live in the city. You find evidence of the Canaanites occupying the city. Very simple. But it fits into a larger picture, which I'm going to follow through with you now. So, again, we have the sense of an eyewitness kind of account in the biblical text. All right, so Joshua 6 says that the people shouted. You know the story, right? They go around the city. They shouted. They blew the trumpet. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted, and the wall fell down flat. Okay, I'll talk about that in a little bit. The people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. So there's a couple key things here. One is this phrase, the wall fell down flat. Different interpreters interpret it different ways. It fell down. The Hebrew is literally, it fell beneath itself. So they say flat. Okay, it's a good translation. They went up into the city. This is a key component of the eyewitness account. Keep this in mind. Now, this is a cross-section of what was discovered at Jericho. And I'm going to show you why this is an accurate depiction of what was found. Okay, so down at the bottom, you have this little stick figure. You see that guy down there at the bottom? And then you've got this sort of gray wall. It's called a retaining wall. In old terminology, it's called a revetment wall. It's a retaining wall. Think of a retaining wall, you know, on your property. You're holding back an embankment of some kind. Okay, this is how the city of Jericho was built. There's an embankment. That is not the wall that the Bible's talking about that fell down. On top of that wall, the retaining wall, was remnants of a mud brick wall that was probably 20 to 25 feet high and up to 10 to 12 feet thick. So this is a very substantial fortification structure. Mud brick was a very common form used for fortifications by the Canaanites and in the ancient world more generally. Then near the top of the city was discovered evidence for another mud brick wall. So you have a very significant fortification structure. The scale of the man at the bottom is accurate. So when the Israelites are looking at this city, Joshua indicates that the city was shut up, literally closed in. This was a very formidable military problem for the Israelites to take this city. You can see just by the scale of it how difficult it would have been. But the biblical text does say, after the walls came down, we're going to talk about that they went up into the city. And that's exactly what we find. We find the whole city is built in a sort of upward kind of fashion. And so whoever wrote the account accurately described what the city looked like at the time of Joshua. Okay? So keep that thought in mind as we walk through some of the evidence and along with it the account. There's Dr. Wood standing at the bottom of the retaining wall. You can see how tall that is. That was built probably at the time of Abraham. So this is long, very long beforehand. This is very, very, very ancient revetment or retaining wall. And on top of that is the mud brick structure that is described as the walls falling down. Okay, I'm going to show you evidence for that in a moment. Okay, there I am standing at the bottom of a portion of it that was also preserved, has been preserved. You can see how large these stones are. Very significant labor force required to build the city. By the way, I hopped down in that hole because right over to the left was this hornet's nest of these. They were flying in and out like crazy, but I wanted to get a picture in there, so I hopped down, somebody took a picture, and I hopped out, and I made it. Survived. Now, here's Dr. Wood standing on top of the wall, and you can see he's got his hand on remnants of some mud brick. Now, that's just a very small portion of the mud brick, but it just shows you that even today, after it's been excavated, there's still remnants of the mud brick wall structure that's left there. And we're going to talk about that some more, and I'll show you some better pictures in a little bit. Here's a reconstruction of Jericho based on the archaeological evidence. All right, so down at the bottom you have the retaining wall, you have the mud brick wall, you'll note buildings built between the two walls and then buildings up on top. Now that's going to be related to the account with Rahab, and I'll explain that to you also soon. I promise I'll bring all of this together for you. Okay, so that's just an artist's reconstruction. We like to do that in archaeology. Look, it's been destroyed, it's been there for thousands of years. Let's draw a nice picture that looks like what we think it looked like. So it's scientific, but some art involved in it. We try not to take too many liberties. We try to follow what we find in the evidence as best we can. All right, so I've given you kind of a broad picture. We have a debate about dates. We have debate about pottery. We have an eyewitness account. We have mud brick walls. We have a retaining wall. So we kind of have that going on. So now I'm going to give you a little archaeology tutorial here, Archaeology 101, if you will. Okay, so here's a view of Jericho. Remember that view of the mound I showed you, the picture? Well, this is flipped now. North is up above, okay? These are all the different places that have been excavated up until the 1950s or so. All right, so the blue is the Germans over 100 years ago, the red is Garstang, and the yellow is Kathleen Kenyon. Now you see that sort of trench, that long, thin line that's going out that's pointing to there, okay? I'm going to take you to there to show you some cool stuff that she found in that trench. So she called that her West Trench, and that's what we'll call it. Now you dig a trench in archaeology because you want to get a picture of the occupation layers. Remember before I called it stratigraphy? When you dig a trench, you can get down inside, you can kind of see what the occupation of the past looks like, the soil change, if there was a fire, what kind of architecture might have been there, and so on. Think of it as a layered cake. Now, it's a kind of a simple illustration. It's more complicated than that, but that's the fundamental idea, a layered cake. So you're in Kenyon's Trench, and you're looking at the layered cake. All right? Okay. So now we're in the trench, and we're looking at the layered cake. You'll notice in the middle of the picture that retaining wall again. You see that down the middle there? All right, it's kind of black. On the right-hand side is a bunch of different stuff that's been colored and is documenting all the different things that have been found. On the left, you'll see this red. You see that? And it looks like it's kind of like formed like a ramp. And right in Kenyon's archaeological report, this is from her report from the 1950s, it says fallen red bricks. Now you'll notice a couple things about it. One is they're outside the walls of the city. So in our little diagram that we looked at before, the bricks fell down this way, out, beyond the retaining wall. The second thing you find is these fallen red bricks resolve the problem of how tall the retaining wall is because they form a ramp. So now the Israelites are marching around the city. The walls fall down. God provides. He not only takes the walls down, he creates a ramp from the walls so the Israelites can climb and go up into the city, every man straight ahead of him. So there it is from the archaeological record. Kenyon admits very clearly this is how the city was destroyed. The walls did come tumbling down. She just dated the site differently than what we would date it. That's where the debate is. But the evidence, once you have the date right, fits perfectly with the biblical account. They don't have to scale the retaining wall because the fallen walls have provided the ramp to go up into the city. And so she describes it exactly along the lines of what I just described. Both walls fell down and the bricks tumbled down the embankment and formed a ramp down at the bottom at the retaining wall. It's a beautiful picture of God's sovereign provision for the Israelites. You are not going to conquer the city, I am going to conquer the city. And here we have in the archaeological record a remarkable picture, in my view, of that exact thing. Here's a picture of that retaining wall. Again, there's some remnants of the mud brick. Just give you a picture of how tall it was, how deep they had to excavate. Jericho's a very deep site. Some sites are shallow. You get to bedrock very quickly. Others are very deep. Depends on what it is. Okay, so you kind of got the picture, the overview, right? We've talked about the walls, talked a little bit about pottery, talked about a trench. See, now you know about excavation trench. So again, you can tell your friends about that. And now we have an interesting thing in the biblical account about Rahab, right? Rahab is redeemed remarkably by God because she acts in faith. She has faith in Yahweh. The word of what God has done in Egypt has reached her ears, and everyone else in the city rejects it, but she doesn't. There's a faith there. It's really remarkable. Think about her living in Canaan, in the city of Jericho, and yet that kernel of faith that was in her heart, the mystery of faith, bursts forth, right? So she lets down a rope through the window. You know the story of the spies going in, right? There's this little detail in the account. It's really fascinating. Her house was on the city wall so that she was living on the wall. Now, you probably have in different translations, ESV, NIV, King James, different ways that the interpreters, translators have tried to handle this, because it's weird. Like, she's living on the wall, her house is in the wall, against the wall. What's going on here in the text? Well, this is where archaeology is very helpful. What we have on the northern side of Jericho from over 100 years ago, this is from the German excavations, a really fascinating set of discoveries. The first thing you'll note is, again, on the right-hand side, a little bit of scale for us. You see the guy at the bottom? See how small he is next to that retaining wall? On the northern part of Jericho, more of the mud brick wall had been preserved than most of the rest of the site. You can see how tall it is standing on top of the retaining wall. And this end of the site really helped archaeologists to understand how tall the mud brick wall originally was, okay? Because a lot of this was preserved. But what's so fascinating about this is that you find built into the structure of the fortifications of the city are domestic houses on the northern end of Jericho. So there you'll see, pointing to those structures that are left, domestic homes built right up against the mud brick wall, the superstructure of the city. And that's exactly what the biblical account, how it describes Rahab's house. So it's possible that Rahab's house was in the northern part of the city because this is the area that was best preserved. It doesn't seem to have been destroyed as significantly as the rest of the site. Now, the Bible doesn't say that the house was in the northern part of the city, but it's a possibility. Their domestic structures, they found normal pottery there and implements related to regular domestic life. Remarkable affirmation of a very small detail in the text that's not necessary. God could have just said, Rahab lived in the city of Jericho. She lived near the wall, or it wouldn't have to say any of that, but it said very specifically she lived against or in or on the wall. And here we have, from the world of archaeology, exactly that at the city of Jericho. Remarkable. A picture, I think, if you want to do a spiritual application of God's redemptive work in Rahab's life, all these centuries later preserved for us in the world of archaeology. Here's just some more old pictures, but nonetheless, the mud brick wall. This helps us again to understand how tall and thick and significant this structure was from all those centuries ago. Here's an artist's depiction. They did not find windows like that. That's an elaboration. But maybe it's a possibility. She did let them out, right, of her house. You can see the flax up there on the roof. She hid them under the flax, right? Okay, so now, of course, the Bible records that Jericho was destroyed by fire, right? Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor are the three cities of destruction. So the Bible describes what happens. The Israelites go into the city, and they light the city on fire, right? So, as I've said, and many have said, there's nothing like a good fire in the archaeological record to correlate with the biblical text to see if they fit with one another. Well, that's exactly what Kenyon describes in her excavation report, that the destruction was complete, the walls and floors were blackened by fire, every room was filled with bricks and timbers and utensils. She says that the collapse seems to have taken place before they were affected by the fire. Now, that's exactly the order that's recorded in the Bible. The walls fell down, the Israelites went into the city, and they lit it on fire. That's the sequence in the Bible. That's what Kenyon says she thinks the sequence is in the archaeological evidence. Fascinating. There's just another picture of the red area is all evidence for fire. This is a different area of excavation. We think correlates with the Israelite destruction. Here's ash about 3 feet thick, found at Jericho, all over the place. The fire was massive, and it just destroyed the city in a very, very violent way. There's a lot of evidence for that. It's been found in the record. There's my friend Joel Kramer in the video, Jericho Unearthed, the guy I interviewed for Digging for Truth. He's showing that ash layer. You could see that right above where his head is. That's all that white. That's all ash from a fire. There's more there. Wish I had that guy's hair. Looks like my dad's hair. My dad got the hair and I didn't. I mean, it's just, Anyway, I'm sorry, that's a side note. I always say in the new heavens and the new earth, I'm going to have the biggest quaff than anybody has, but that's a side note. So look at that destruction by fire. Okay, so it's pretty cool, I think. Very interesting. Now we have another detail in the biblical account. Now there's a lot of spiritual application here. I'm sure you'll do this when you do your Joshua study. All right, so Joshua is commanded specifically not to plunder the city. Okay, they are, the city's under the ban, but everything belongs to God. They are not allowed to plunder the city in any kind of way. Okay, they're allowed to take the gold and the silver for the treasury. Everything else is to be committed to destruction. They're not permitted to take anything from the city. And you remember the story of Achan, of course, in the next chapter, and the defeat of the Israelites at Ai is because of Achan's sin. Then there's repentance, the terrible consequence of judgment comes upon Achan and his family, and then the Israelites are victorious at Ai. Okay? So that's the context. God has put it under the ban. You are not to plunder the city. And ancient armies always plundered the city. You didn't burn the city first. You went in, you plundered it, then you destroyed it, right? You took everything that was there that was worth something. That's what military conquests do, for the most part, right? Okay, so what we find is this remarkable correlation with the biblical account. Both Garstang and Kenyon found jars of grain, just like the ones you see here, in storage jars from the time of Joshua, filled with grain, scorched by a fire. So what does this tell us? One is the city's occupied. There's people living in the city when it's destroyed because the grain jars are full. If people left the city, they would have taken them with them. Grain was a very valuable commodity in the ancient world. The grain was burned. So it was burned and destroyed by a fire. That means that the Israelites did not plunder the grain. They would have plundered the grain had God not told them to have everything under the ban. So under normal circumstances, they would have taken the grain out of the city before they set it on fire because it was valuable and it would have been used for their own people or for trade or for whatever. The third component is that the storage jars are all late Bronze I, all from the time of Joshua. Garstang, Kenyon, and the Germans all found jars like this filled with grain. I should say not the Germans, I'm not sure about that, but Garstang and Kenyon for sure, okay? So, excuse me. Now the Bible also indicates that the harvest had just taken place. Now typically what you do in the ancient world, and even in modern day in a military conquest, you think of something as horrific as the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War, right? The Nazis sieged Leningrad in the Soviet Union for 900 days. 900 days. They starved the city. Over 1 million people died in Leningrad during the siege of Leningrad, right? So after a siege of a city, you siege it, the people deplete all their resources. They have to. But in the case of Jericho, it's a very short siege because the jars are filled with grain. They had just been out for harvest. The Bible says it was harvest time, right after the Passover. It's harvest time. In Israel, the harvest time is in the spring, in the southern Jordan Rift Valley. So they go into the city. It's a short siege. How long is the siege? It's 7 days. That's it. Only 7 days they had sieged the city. The Canaanites didn't have time to deplete their grain from storage. They were only 7 days, right? If it had been 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, they would have eaten all their food. But they didn't. And this fits very well with the biblical account. Here's some more. These are storage jars discovered by Kenyon. They're all Canaanite. They're all from the time of Joshua. They fit perfectly with the account. Very detailed descriptions in the biblical text and very detailed in the archaeological record of what is discovered. Here's some more close-ups of that. I mean, it was all over the place, these jars are remarkable. You don't find this very often in the world of archaeology, except, if you have an accidental fire, somebody starts a fire in the city and everybody's got to get out, then you're going to have this kind of situation. But a military conquest, it just doesn't fit. And so, what I like to say is, we have to engage in sort of this esoteric debate about pottery. Did this piece of pottery shaped like this, or is it bent like that? Or is it over here like this, or is it bent like that? And then have a debate among scholars about what the date of the pottery is. And that's something that has to be done. But for you as laymen in the church, and for me talking to you about it, I want to look at the bigger picture. So the Bible tells us certain things about what happened to Jericho. Then we go to the archaeological record and we find all these correlations. Now, if somebody wants to follow the argument that the city was destroyed 150 years earlier, so when the Israelites showed up there, the city was not occupied, then how did the author of the biblical text invent a story that fits all the archaeology from 150 years later. That just doesn't make any sense to me. It's never made any sense. Not even just being around archaeologists, just from a logical, critical thinking perspective, this argument has never made sense to me. And so the debate about pottery is very important, but the bigger picture, I think, is even more important, because we have these remarkable correlations. The walls fell down. That's what the Bible says. That's exactly what happened to Jericho, down to the very details of the ramp going up into the city. The Bible says they went up in the city. That's exactly what it describes. There was a fire. Nobody disputes that. The Bible says it. The archaeological record is absolutely certain. Nobody disagrees about that. The city was not plundered. It's clear from the grain. And that's what the biblical text says. And the biblical text indicates or implies that the Israelites were obedient. Contra Achan, right? Rahab's house built against the wall. We find domestic structures on the northern side of Jericho that fit perfectly. Her house was spared. She was spared. Her and her family were spared. Maybe this implies that her house was not destroyed. It's an inference on my part, but I think a reasonable one based on the archaeological record. The siege was short. I used the example of Leningrad as the sort of opposite of that. The attack happened in the spring. The grain harvest had just come in. The jars were full. The Israelites went up into the city, as I mentioned. And so this gives you a summary. I wanted to just give you a little 101 archaeology. Hey, what do you guys do? How does this work? You know, we just go dig in the ground randomly. How do you do that? Well, we do like the trench. We record everything that we find. That's what we're doing at Shiloh. That's what we did at Ai. That's what archaeologists are supposed to do. Very meticulous drawings, photographs, videography. Now we have drones, which is awesome because we can get a picture of a site much better than we could 20 years ago. Really remarkable correlations. I want to encourage you to watch those episodes of Digging for Truth as a supplement to sort of affirm what I've showed you, and you'll find other points in those episodes that I did not mention. The last thing I would say is, there's the famous question of how did the walls fall? Some people say it was from the trumpet sound, right? The trumpets caused the walls to fall. Some people say it was an angel of the Lord. The text doesn't say that, but maybe an angel of the Lord brought it down. There's been different theories, but the author of Hebrews actually tells us that it was the faith of the Israelites. Now, in our modern culture, faith is just sort of this thing where you cover your eyes and you leap into the abyss. But biblical faith isn't that, is it? God speaks, and we have a choice about how we're going to respond to that speaking. And that's what Joshua and the Israelites, they believed what God said that he was going to do, that he was going to bring them victory, right? He said it, they believed it. That's faith, because God can't lie. God always speaks the truth. God is never wrong. He's never late. He never breaks his promises. And here, the Israelites act what must have been absurd to the Canaanites. Think about them watching these idiots go around the city, right? Think about that. Now, and think about how our faith is caricatured at times that way. And we have to find ways, of course, to talk to people about that. That's not what faith is. This is what faith is. We have to explain the gospel to them. We have to explain what true faith is. It's not a leap into the dark. It's believing that God has spoken and that we believe it. But the walls of Jericho fell down by faith, real faith. Faith that when God speaks, we can believe what he says. So the lesson from Jericho, there's a great many lessons. The greatest application is this: to believe God will bring down your walls of Jericho. He'll provide the ramp to go up into the city. If he's put a vision in your mind and heart, or whatever it is that you are dealing with, that is your Jericho, God is with you. Now, it's going to be in a variety of different ways. And ultimately, he's already conquered the Canaanites for us through his son, hasn't he? Right? He's defeated. The victory is already ours. All we're waiting for is for him to return. That's all that's left in the story, right? The other part of it is that the evidence encourages my own personal walk with God. When I have doubts about this or that, I go back to these accounts and I remember, no, God speaks, he's faithful. The gospel is, as Jesus called it, the new and everlasting covenant. It's not like the law. It's not like the law of Moses. It's everlasting. It's a fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, right? The promise to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. God cannot break that promise. And so, for me, application is apologetic. I hope for you it's apologetic. You have a place to go if you have that worker who says, I don't believe the Bible, these accounts, blah, 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 blah. Well, listen, I don't know a lot about that, but go check out these videos. Comes to faith, you have an opportunity to talk about what real faith is. There's many entry points that God provides for us to talk to people outside the church, but to lift us up, because we're living in Canaan, and we need to be lifted up, right? I need it. You need it. We all need it. These accounts and the archaeology related to it, I believe, edify the heart of God's people. It certainly does for me. It's transformed my life, not because of pottery and things like that, but because the God who does what he does has redeemed me from the dominion of sin, and that's a remarkable thing.